Most people married late, usually around the age of 27. Couples, however, would not marry until they could financially support themselves. During the late 18th century, there were two main types of families. There were extended families and nuclear families. An extended family consisted of a 3 or 4 generation clan. They were led by a patriarch or a matriarch. An extended family included everyone from the youngest infant to the oldest grandparent. A nuclear family was one that consisted only of the father, mother, and children. Most newly married couples that chose to be an extended family lived with the bride or groom's family rather than developing their own home. On the contrary, in a nuclear family, couples developed their own homes and raised their children away from their parents. During the 18th century, nuclear families were more common than extended families. It was not uncommon for people to work within the family. Boys learned to plow and weave, while the girls spun and tended to cows. However, at a young age, many boys and girls learned independence by going to become servants, apprentices, and laborers. Men tended to leave home to work with craftsmen and learn to trade, while young girls left home to work as servants. Both the boys and the girls worked hard, but unlike the boys, many of the girls were subject to sexual abuse. Boys tended to be verbally and physically abused, but were still not as vulnerable to the sexual abuse as the girls. A history of Western society. For most of Western and Central Europe around 1750, there were very few illegitimate children, which meant there were very few bastards. The English parish registers rarely ever listed more than one bastard out of every 20 children that were baptized. As far as official church kept records, illegitimacy was a rarity. However, while illegitimate babies were fairly rare, premarital sex was very common. A quote taken from the textbook A History of Western Society was, "In one well-studied English village, 33% of all first children were conceived before the couple was married, and many were born within 3 months of the marriage ceremony." In tighter communities and rural villages, there were community controls set over premarital sex and adultery. Community controls were actions taken to prevent any feelings of economic, social, or moral threats to a closely knit community. The people of these tightly knit communities, often parents and elderly people, as well as other authority heads such as priests and landlords, tried to limit premarital sex to those who had the thought of marriage in their heads. Their main goal was to do away with unexpected pregnancy, pregnant brides, and illegitimate babies. Illegitimate births began to steadily increase from 1750 to 1850. This was when Europe experienced an illegitimacy explosion, which was, according to A History of Western Society, the result of a breakdown of late marriages and a few births out of wedlock that began occurring in the second half of the 18th century. In this time, many young women were partaking in premarital sex, and worse, many young men were not marrying the women they got pregnant. Because of this, there was huge sexual and cultural transformation. The growth of the cottage industry allowed for young men and women to become independent earlier. It created new opportunities for people so that they were not just tied to their land. One great thing that the cottage industry allowed was for young people to attain greater independence at a younger age, without having to rely on inheritance. This allowed the young men to get married and start families without a great worry of not being able to support them. In the end, people started to get married for different reasons, not just because of an unexpected pregnancy. When young women started to migrate to towns and cities in search of permanent employment, a lot of them found work as servants or textile workers. Therefore, with unpleasant work, many of them sought out marriage and family life as a sort of escape from their brutal realities of work. On the other hand, young men who were soldiers or day laborers or male servants were very sincere in their proposals to these women. However, with unstable jobs, they were still hesitant to take on the challenge of a wife and a family. Because of this, many young women still struggled in turning pregnancy into marriage. Among the common people, marriage and family were once again breaking down and did not become more stable until the late 19th century. A History of Western Society. Women used to nurse their children for a much longer period of time than they do today. They would do so because nursing for a longer time would decrease the likelihood of pregnancy and therefore space out their children. They liked to keep them 2 to 3 years apart. Wet nursing became popular in the 18th century. Wet nursing was when lower-class women would suckle the babies of the upper-class women. This, however, led to the wet nurses neglecting and not being able to nurse their own children. Infanticide was the act of forcing a newborn baby to die when there were already too many mouths to feed. The early medieval church, which was greatly influenced by Jewish law, stated that infanticide was a pagan practice, and they insisted that every human life was sacred. Killing a young child became known as a crime punishable by death. However, direct and indirect ways of getting rid of unwanted babies did not disappear. If a young mother was not able to take care of her baby, there were still options for her, especially if she was young and not married. One option was to leave the newborn baby bundled up on the doorstep of a church. In the early 1700s, homes for the abandoned babies were developed. They were called fondling homes. By the end of the 18th century, European fondling hospitals were admitting around 100,000 babies a year. Unfortunately, many of these babies died. 90% of babies admitted to fondling homes or hospitals ended up dying because of neglect before they arrived. Relationships between parents and children were not close ones at the time. Many of the feelings between the two were influenced by the fact that death was so common among the children. Parents and adults were not emotionally attached to children. Medical establishments were not interested in the care of children and often encouraged parents not to become emotionally involved in their children just because of the fact it was not likely they would survive. The great 18th century English historian Edward Gibbon wrote the following quote: "Emotional detachment from the children often led to greater discipline and abuse. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote a famous and influential treatise, Emile, in 1762. It suggested greater love and more tender care towards children. It also introduced new ways of teaching children. It encouraged women to nurse their own babies and support fondling homes, discouraging infanticide." By the end of the 18th century, many changes had been made which led parents to love their children more. They began to show greater feelings and take pleasure in raising their babies. These new changes mirrored the optimism people were beginning to have, along with the 18th century Enlightenment. Schools and formal education started to become more and more important in society. Aristocracy and the rich led the way in starting to form schools and special colleges in the 16th century, which were often run by Jesuits. Elementary schools for children from the ages of 7 to 12 did not start to appear until the 17th century. These schools taught basic literacy and religion. Protestants and Catholics encouraged and promoted popular literacy between 1500 and 1800. This was because they wanted the people to read the Bible. Therefore, being literate was important to the different religious groups. They wanted to instill their teachings more effectively. However, still many common people failed to receive any form of formal education. In the 1700s, Prussia began to lead the way for the development of universal education. It made attendance at elementary schools mandatory, and other German states started to follow in their path. The Church of England established charity schools to teach poor children. This began the growth of more elementary education throughout Europe, and eventually led to the remarkable growth of literacy from 1600 to 1800. While women still lagged behind men, they were also increasing in literacy significantly.
During the 18th century, bread became the main staple food. On average, French peasants ate nearly 2 pounds of bread a day, whereas peasants in Scotland ate primarily oatmeal. Scottish peasants would eat their oatmeal half-cooked so that it would swell in their stomachs to make them feel more full. Rural and urban poor primarily ate vegetables, because vegetables were considered poor people's food. The poor rarely ate meat, because the price became too expensive. Peasants believed that prices should be fair, protecting both consumers and producers, and imposed by government decree if needed. Milk also was never rarely drank, because many people suffered from allergies. The basic diet of the peasants, consisting of bread and vegetables, was adequate for the time. The only dietary concern of the bread and vegetables diet was that the bread and vegetables did not allow the peasants to receive enough of vitamins A or C. The lack of vitamin C in the peasants' diet caused scurvy. The rich also lacked vitamins A and C, but for a different reason. Gout was common within the rich because of the aristocracy's overeating and being under-exercised. Health science played a small role in the improvement of people's health. During the 18th century, there was a rise in the number of health practitioners. Faith healers, apothecaries, physicians, surgeons, and midwives were all able to provide a healing touch. The faith healers believed that demons and evil spirits cause disease by living in people. The only treatment to release the evil spirits was exorcisms. The apothecaries sold herbs, drugs, and patent medicines. Hospitals during the 18th century were uncleanly and filled with a plethora of diseases. The hospital setup was very different than the setup of hospitals today. Patients during the 18th century were not isolated from other patients, and many operations were done in the patient's room or even their bed. The hospital staff was unhappy, and the majority of the time, the staff were drunken women. During the 18th century, mental illnesses became very popular. A typical treatment for mental illness was bleeding and cold water. Mentally ill patients that were violent were chained to the wall and left alone. During the 18th century, there were two main types of churches, the parish church and the local church. The parish church focused on religious devotion. They also organized processions and trips to local shrines. The local church held the administrative jobs. These jobs were held by priests, pastors, or lay volunteers. The Protestant revival began in Germany. 18th century Protestant reformers put an end to all medieval practices that they felt were wrong and unnecessary. The Protestant revival in Germany was called Pietism. A man named John Wesley became interested in Pietism. Wesley was ordained as an Anglican priest. He then created a holy club with students known as Methodists. During the 18th century, there were many different types of religious celebrations and festivals. These events were all displayed at Carnival. Carnival was a time of celebration in Catholic and Mediterranean Europe. Each town or city had an array of entertainment opportunities, ranging from horse races, sports, bullfights, boxing, optical illusions, and theater for the upperclassmen. Bullfighting became one of the most popular of the entertainment options.